want to talk about something today, and I want to pick up. I want to continue. Last week I showed you a picture that really troubled me of Bill Gates Sr. standing with the Rockefellers. And I want to show that picture again. Jared, if you can put that up there. And this is the same picture, and I have to confess that I looked at it, I just saw Mr. Gates there, and I saw Mr. Rockefeller in the back, and I said, oh my goodness, who are these other people? I'll get back to that, and I told you guys about it. And you see a lady on the left with a green dress? And who's standing right aside of her with the glasses? That's Dr. Fauci. And so when I saw that Dr. Fauci was connected with Mr. Gates, was connected with Mr. Rockefeller, that really caused me some serious pause. Nothing at that level is a coincidence. This isn't just a birthday party that he happened to attend. What is going on here? These people are all about their one world agenda. They're all about this virus to end mankind and take out 7.5 billion people and need a vaccine. And so when I saw Dr. Fauci standing there in that photo, it just put chills over me. And it should you as well. I want to look at some of the things that are going on right now. One of the really good news broadcasters here in the country is a gentleman named Lou Dobbs. And he's been doing investigative type reporting for a long time. I want to show you a little clip of something that Lou Dobbs had to say here this week.
The deadly Wuhan virus that shut down much of America has now infected more than 2 million people all around the world and killed more than 133,000 others. In the United States, the Wuhan virus has infected now 619,000 Americans and killed 27,000 more. As the numbers continue to rise, President Trump has made it clear he holds both China and the World Health Organization responsible, and that there will be consequences. President Trump has announced the first of those consequences. He ordered a freeze on the hundreds of millions of dollars the United States contributes each year to the World Health Organization. The president says the group is complicit in China's efforts to cover up the impending pandemic, for which the Chinese are entirely responsible.
The WHO failed to investigate credible reports from sources in Wuhan that conflicted directly with the Chinese government's official accounts. There was credible information to suspect human-to-human transmission in December 2019, which should have spurred the WHO to investigate and investigate immediately.
And the decision to halt funding, bringing howls of criticism from Chinese-aligned multinationals, globalist billionaires, Wall Street and their lobbyists, the Chamber of Commerce, of course, rhinos and radical Dems, such as Nancy Pelosi, who today wrote this, quote, "This decision is dangerous, illegal, and will be swiftly challenged." Her comments echoed by Communist China's foreign ministry today, which demanded the United States earnestly fulfill their tasks and obligations to the WHO. This is the same foreign ministry whose propaganda began the lie and sustained the outrageous nonsense of that lie, and it added that the U.S. military had brought the deadly disease to China. Remarkable. Well, China's propaganda and lies have been so fully exposed over the past 2 months that almost everyone in the world knows that China lies and is responsible for millions of infections and more than 100,000 deaths. Yet the Chinese government lies continue despite that exposure. A new report today shows Communist Party leaders covered up information for almost a week in full knowledge that they were facing the prospect of a complete outbreak of the coronavirus and that the contagion was sweeping through Hubei province. How critical were those 6 days in which the Chinese covered up the deadly nature of the contagion that they had unleashed? The University of Southampton in the UK filed a report showing China's cover-up cost as many as 95% of the world's cases.
That's pretty stunning. 95% of the cases in the world could have been stopped, but apparently something's going on. I don't buy that it's an accident, not at all. In fact, we've been talking from the very beginning that it was no coincidence that the city that this broke out in is the city where the the bioweapons lab is. By the way, that bioweapons lab, bioresearch lab, whatever you want to call it, is on a military base. Just saying. And so now, as we go looking for answers, I want quality answers, if I can put it that way. I want quality answers. And so I found a Dr. Rashid Buttar. And Dr. Buttar is so well credentialed. And I could have cut this video shorter, but I want you to hear the credentials that the man has. And then I want you to pay attention to what he says. And some of it, he speaks a little bit like a doctor, and it gets a little over your head a little bit. But follow, because he doesn't go too far over your head. And this was a 45-minute interview, and I only took a few minutes of it. But you'll want to even see the whole thing at some point. But I want you to see this little piece of what he has to say. This is one of the world's leading doctors in his field.
Buttar. He graduated from Washington University with a double major in biology and theology before attending medical school at the University of Osteopathic Medicine and Health Sciences College of Medicine and Surgery. He trained in general surgery and emergency medicine and served as brigade surgeon and director of emergency medicine while serving in the U.S. Army. He is a board-certified clinical metal toxicology and preventative medicine. He is board eligible in emergency medicine and has achieved fellowship status in 3 separate medical societies. Today, he serves as the medical director for the Centers for Advanced Medicine with clinics in California and North Carolina. These clinics specialize in the needs of patients with immune dysfunctions and toxicity issues, usually manifesting in various conditions such as cancer, heart disease, and autism. And for over 20 years, he has been ranked as one of the top 50 doctors in the United States. His first book, The 9 Steps to Keep the Doctor Away, became a Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and Amazon bestseller, and is now an international best-selling book translated into multiple languages. Now this week, a video he made called out the fraud that is being perpetuated across the world by the World Health Organization, the CDC, Bill Gates, the deep state, the mainstream media. It went viral with millions of views worldwide. Doctor, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Gary. Appreciate it.
Now, 3 weeks ago, you called this a conspiracy. You called out the hysteria being perpetuated to scare the world population based on false data. Now, it was Jerome Adams this week, the Surgeon General, and the Trump administration who agreed with you when they announced that they had dropped the World Health Organization and the CDC model and are now working with real numbers. Okay, this is directly from the White House. This is the Office of the Press Secretary. Now, Tuesday, the White House putting out this press release demanding accountability from the World Health Organization and committed to investigating the response, the false claims, and the cover-up. So explain to our viewers what led you to this discovery and how the numbers never supported their claims.
Well, Gary, basically, I have patients from all over the world, and patients were concerned about this, and they asked, and I put out in social media that, look, if you really want to know, I'll make a video about this. And I expected some people to respond. I had, I don't know, 700-800 responses. Just yes, please get us the information. So I asked the question because you're hearing stuff about conspiracy. So those videos that we put out were actually asking the question, COVID-19 conspiracy ? And as I started looking at it, I mean, to me, it just didn't make any sense anyway. We deal with the hardest to deal with medical conditions anyway. So it wasn't a big deal. I just remembered that when I heard about the coronavirus aspect, there was one particular component that we used intravenously a lot in our clinic, and I just made sure that we had 10 times the normal amount, and that was it. It wasn't a big deal. It didn't bother me. However, as I started looking at this information, and as I started seeing that this is actually a chimeric version, something that was developed here in the United States in 2015, it was published in Nature magazine, that it was developed in the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where all the initial studies were done. The chimeric research, despite having a moratorium by the US government to prevent any chimeric research, by the way, just so your audience understands, chimeric research basically means that they're taking a naturally occurring substance or virus, in this case, and then mutating it, genetically modifying it, changing the configuration morphologically to gain function. It's called a gain of function study or gain of function research. And that basically means that they're making something that already may have some potential to cause harm, making it more harmful, making it more virulent, making it more resistant. And basically that's what I found, that they took the SHC014 strain of the coronavirus, the surface antigen component and brought in the backbone from the SARS coronavirus, put them together, and then inserted HIV and MERS orthologs on top of it to make a more virulent, more detrimental virus. Now, the thing is that
if I could jump in for just a moment here, because what I think you're talking about is the moratorium that was placed, and then $3.7 million from the National Institute of Health was transferred to China so they could continue this research, even though the moratorium. So they basically outsourced this research to China. Is this the same topic we're talking about here? This news is just breaking?
Yes, this is exactly right. So it goes back to 2014. The U.S. government decided, based upon certain virologists at that time, saying that, look, there's no justification for this kind of research. There's a potential for it to cause harm, cause a pandemic. So there's no justification for us to do this type of research. So the government passed a moratorium in 2014. Fauci approved approved budgets to be monies to be sectioned for this type of research. So basically, and I'm getting really, every time I think about this, it gets me really flustered because I'm so angry that he basically broke the law. He more than broke the law. He created this entire cascade that we're seeing with the world shutdown was created by this initial aspect back in 2015. He broke the law. He went against government moratoriums. He took taxpayer money and he funded research that has now led to the COVID-19. In 2017, he was documented at Georgetown University saying that there will be a pandemic that this presidency will face, that this term will face. How did he know that in 2017 that something was going to happen in 2018, 19, or 2020? You can't predict the market from 3 days from today, what's going to happen. How did he know that there was going to be a pandemic? He stated the president of this president will face a pandemic. The exact quotes, I don't want to say the exact words. You guys have the video footage. My point is that when somebody starts making these type of statements, and then they were involved with the breaking of the law to fund the research that American taxpayers paid for, that then goes to Wuhan and now trying to create this diversion and say that it was China. God, I don't know whether it came from China or released in China, whether it was already released here. It's irrelevant. The complicity of what's going on right now, whether it was released in China or whether it was already here or however it happened, the U.S. system has condoned it, has jumped on it. They're opportunistic. They're shutting down the economy when they know, in fact, that there's no basis. I mean, there's no virus that leaves 6 feet or 12 feet. Now they're saying 13 feet. Complete misinformation. And I'm sorry that you've pulled the chain on me right now, but the mainstream media, when the Surgeon General came out and said that basically the Gates model, the Fauci model, the World Health Organization model was not going to be followed anymore, and they were going to look at the actual data, the actual numbers, the mainstream media didn't respond at all. All they said was, it seems like we're going to be going to 2022 before people can assemble together. That's what ABC put out. And Fox, or was it New York Post put out, it seems like that the 6 feet of social distancing is not going to be sufficient. It needs to go to 13 feet. There is no virus, bacteria that jumps 13 feet. It defies every logical aspect of science and medicine. And what really, really pisses me off is that there are thousands, tens of thousands of doctors and scientists out there that know that this is a fraud, and they're not saying anything. Either one, they're scared of social ostracization because they're going to be called out, or social shaming, or they're afraid of that they're going to lose their license. For God's sake, this is changing the planet, and every scientist and every doctor that knows this to be a facade needs to open their mouth and speak. There is every aspect of science has just been literally picked up, thrown in the toilet and flushed down. It's like everybody's ignoring it.
With my wife, Angie, and I. We'll see you at the next report. For the Next News Network, I'm Gary Franchi.
That report goes on for probably 40 more minutes, and it's worth watching because this is just some of what he reveals. But it is what we talked about, and he goes into even more. But he is a man of great credentials, and for him to be speaking like he is profound. And he said two things in there that I want to make sure you got. One was that $3.7 million was given to China to carry on this research by the NIH. Well, the NIH is the agency that Dr. Fauci heads. And so pay attention. He's the director of the NIH, the National Institute of Health. When I first saw him, I thought, oh, he must be with the CDC. And then I read a little bit, National Institute of Health. Okay. Well, the NIH is what funded this thing after they were not supposed to do it. And the other thing that's really critical, one of the things that's important to do as you figure these things out is you've got to connect the dots. And so there was a big dot he just put out there, and that's that this all happened in the year 2015. There was a moratorium put on this type of research in 2014. In 2015, they carried it out. But what was 2015 also notable for? In the very first message that I did about the dark history of the coronavirus, that is the year that the patent was applied for. No coincidence to any of this stuff. No coincidence whatsoever. I want to go back to Lou Dobbs. He's got something else to say.
A number of government sources say there is a high level of confidence that Communist China is covering up the origins of the Wuhan virus, and they now are comfortable in questioning whether the virus came from a laboratory at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That is a question, of course, that we have raised on this broadcast for the past number of weeks. The sources say the laboratory was working with a coronavirus that was being carried by horseshoe bats from southern China in Yunnan province. It is believed by these same sources that patient 0 worked at the laboratory and somehow carried the disease into the Wuhan population. How or exactly why that occurred, if it did occur, is still unknown and far, far from certain. We're also learning that the Wuhan laboratory was operating far below its biosafety level 4 designation, and sources have confirmed that 2 years ago, officials from the U.S. Embassy in Beijing sent cables back to the State Department in which they warned of those safety issues. President Trump with this reaction.
Well, I don't want to say that, John, but I will tell you more and more we're hearing the story, and we'll see when you say multiple sources. But we are doing a very thorough examination of this horrible situation that happened.
In your many conversations with President Xi, Mr. President, did you ever discuss with him State Department concerns about lax safety protocols that had been reported to the State Department?
I don't want to discuss what I talked to him about the laboratory. I just don't want to discuss it. It's inappropriate right now.
And in response to the report, the Communist Chinese Party today once again used the World Health Organization to shield their culpability. The Chinese said, quote, "The head of the WHO has stated many times that there is no evidence that the new coronavirus originated in the laboratory." End statement. Defense Secretary Mark Esper this morning said China has been lying from the start, and there is no reason to believe anything they say.
I can't speak to intelligence matters, but I find it hard to trust.
None of them thought that they could dismiss entirely the possibility that it was engineered. Nothing is conclusive quite yet. What is conclusive is that for months, China deliberately covered up the severity of the Wuhan virus and unleashed it on an unsuspecting world.
He's being kind. I think where there's smoke, there's fire. I think there's enough evidence already that's going to ultimately lead to a verdict. I'll grant you there's not enough to really convict yet, but I think it's pretty clear. So we're talking about the foundations of our nation, and I'm going to look at the foundations because it's so important. And I want to start today with Romans chapter 13. I want to take a minute and read starting in verse 1. Romans chapter 13. And we've talked about this a little bit, but I want to go a little further into Romans chapter 13 because so many poor, pointy-head little preachers just think that this is a command to bow down and lick the boots of your would-be oppressors. And I think that by the time we're done today, you'll see that that's not the case. And I started out the way I did so you can see sort of what's going on here with all of this. Verse 1. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resists the power resists the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Will you then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and you shall have praise of the same. For he is a minister of God to thee for good. But if you do that which is evil, be afraid, because he bears not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that does evil. Wherefore you must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues. Tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Now, that is the command, and we've already discussed that that's not just giving us a blanket order to follow government no matter what. And I want to explore that a little bit today. I said I'd get back to that. In order to really be able to understand our Christian role, I said it was necessary to look at the history of our nation a bit so you could really understand who we are and how we're supposed to act. And so I intend to do that. And I want to mix it back and forth between what's going on today and some of these voices from the past. So a recent order has come out in many states that you have to wear a mask. And when I saw that, it really immediately struck a nerve with me, because if you remember your history of World War II, that was what Adolf Hitler did with the Jews. He made them wear masks? Nope. They had to wear an armband with a Star of David on it. You say, yeah, but that was different. He was just identifying the Jews. Yeah, he was showing who was compliant. And maybe this is different, but I see it the same way. Let's just say that it echoed the same thing to me. So are you, who's out with a mask on, willing to be compliant, willing to be told what to do? And in this state, the governor was careful to say that it was necessary if you could not be socially distanced 6 feet from people. And so, but the news media, of course, takes that to mean anytime you're out in public, any place, you must have a mask on. And that's an order. Well, that isn't the order. And so, but I just note these little encroachments. There's a group called New Yorkers for Constitutional Governance, I think is the name of them. And they're a group of pastors, and they're always watching over different Christian issues. And when the governor came out and talked about no groups of 50 or more people, they quickly jumped onto that and said, we need to cooperate with them and do all that. And I'm like, yeah, I don't think cooperating is such a good idea here, because I don't think this is real. And the governor has recently come out and said absolutely no churches can meet, not any congregations of any people whatsoever, period. And now the New Yorkers for Constitutional Freedom say, well, we think he's overreaching a little bit. We don't think he really has the authority to do that. In which case, he doesn't have the authority. I'm going to show you that today. You should have pushed back at the very beginning when he tried to take authority that he does not have. For example, if the governor of a state were to come to you and say, yeah, I think that you should live in the Philippines, and I'm telling you to go live in the Philippines. You say, sorry, pal, you don't have the authority to tell me that. Period, end discussion. And you wouldn't honor it, and you wouldn't be required to honor it. All of our government officials have limits that they have to work in. And even within our laws, if they step outside of those limits, they have stepped outside of the covering and the boundaries of their oath of office. And when they do that, they are personally liable for what they do. Now, they'll never tell you that, and a lot of people say, well, the politicians can't be sued, they're covered under some immunity. Perhaps that's true, provided that they act within the scope of the guidelines of their offices. But when they step outside of that, they are personally liable. And it's proven time and time again in the courts. Besides which, in the very beginning, when everybody was wearing masks, the big news was you're wasting the masks because only the N95 masks work. Nothing else works to stop this virus. Now they're saying, well, just get some underwear and put it on your face and just have a mask, or get a what do you call those? Bandana. Yeah, get a bandana or something and throw it over your face. And I thought from the very beginning they said it wasn't going to stop it. And so where's the science? What are they actually doing that actually has value except extracting more and more control? What's the next thing they're going to do? They're talking about it constantly. Test, test, test. We have to test everybody. We have to test everybody. I'm sorry, I'm not sick. I wasn't sick. I don't need your test. And no, you can't have my DNA. Sorry, I really believe that's part of their end game. They want to get everybody's DNA. No way, DNA. Not happening. Now, another thing is, through all of this stuff that they're doing, I'm really suspect how many people are actually dying from the coronavirus. And there's a lot of question about that. And one of the other things that is very obvious is that people are dying because hospitals, who are now laying off nurses, are kind of almost quasi out of business because all the elective things aren't being done. Well, elective things in hospital terms aren't just teeth whitening. Oh, I didn't get my teeth whitened this month. I'll skip it and I'll do it in a couple months. No, a lot of times it's different surgeries that need to be done, and people are dying because they can't have those surgeries and things that were planned. And so there's a real downside to all of this that they just keep pretending isn't going to happen whatsoever. It isn't happening whatsoever. And so I want to look at some people in history, and I want to begin to explain some of how our nation came to be. And I want to show a gentleman to you here, and we put him up there. See if you know who this gentleman is. Anybody recognize him? He's King James. It's 1603. And he is recognized, King James recognized that even this came from King James, that a ruler's authority has limits. And listen to what he said. A king ceases to be a king and degenerates into a tyrant as soon as he leaves off to rule away from according to his own laws. So he understood something. He understood that I have to follow God's laws, and as soon as I leave and create my own laws, I am a tyrant. So I'm going to suggest that the very definition of a tyrant is someone who leaves the law that they're supposed to follow. In 1643, a pastor named Samuel Rutherford wrote a book called Lex Rex, which is the Latin, and it means the law and the prince. And I want to read a little quote from that. God has given no absolute and unlimited power to a king above the law of God. When the magistrate does anything by violence and without law against his office, he is no longer a magistrate. I want you to hear that. You see, even our law recognizes that when a public official acts outside of the oath of his office, the bounds of his office, he's personally liable. Then, going back, so he's no longer a magistrate, then that power which he does is not of God. None does then resist the ordinance of God who resists the king in his tyrannical acts. I want to make that clear. Forever, pastors understood that. Pastors in America have been lulled to sleep. The African pastors know that. We had the opportunity a couple of years ago to have a bunch of them here. They understood that. The American pastors have gone to sleep. They've been lulled to sleep. Therefore, an unjust king is not that genuine ordinance of God. So we may resist the injustice of the king and not resist the king, because he's not acting as a king. If then any casts off the nature of a king and becomes a tyrant, he is not from God. The office of a tyrant, as contrary to the office of a king, is not from God. So neither is the power from God. So when they're not acting according to the law they're supposed to follow, the pastors understood then he's not a king. He's not someone we have to follow. We do not just give blind obedience, because it says in Romans 13:1, let every soul be subject unto the higher power. Well, that means that the king also has to be subject to the power over him. And if he is not, we do not have to follow that. I want you to understand that. Christian does not mean pansy. It does not mean pansy. There was an English philosopher named John Locke, and he also wrote regarding limited authority. Listen to what he said. Wheresoever the authority ceases, the king ceases also, and he becomes like other men who have no authority. If you haven't committed a crime in any way, and a police officer comes up to you and says, let me see your ID, what do you tell them? Get lost, pal. I don't have to show you my ID any more than I have to show it to the kid who walks up to me in the street. Period. You say, well, how could you talk to a police officer like that? It's important that you understand that you're supposed to talk to a police officer like that. We are supposed to keep all of them in line. And if we just bow down and do whatever, they will take more and more power all the time. This is true in our Constitution. Like I've been telling you, you step outside the bounds of office, you're personally liable. Titus chapter 3, verse 1 says this, put them in mind to be subject to the principalities and powers, to obey magistrates, and to be ready to every good work. There's a pastor named Samuel West, and he preached a sermon from this just 1 month before signing the Declaration of Independence. And he addressed the difference between magistracy and tyranny. The same principles which oblige us to submit to government do oblige us to resist tyranny, or that tyranny and magistracy are so opposed to each other that where one begins, the other one ends. Why would he say that the principles that oblige us to submit to government also equally oblige us to resist tyranny? I go back to what Romans 13:1 says, which is let everyone be subject to the power, to the higher power. Pastor Samuel Cook was preaching in Cambridge, Massachusetts on May 30th, 1770. And he was preaching before the Lieutenant Governor and Commander-in-Chief, Thomas Hutchinson. And listen to what he said. Now, this was the British commander. And listen to what he said. Justice also requires of rulers in their legislative capacity that they attend to the operation of their own acts and repeal whatever laws are inconsistent with the laws of God, the rights of men, and the general benefit of society. Everybody has always understood. All the pastors have always preached. You don't follow a law or a king who's a tyrant. You owe him no obligations whatsoever. In fact, you have obligations to resist him. Listen to what 2 Samuel chapter 23, verse 3 says. Rhonda pointed this out a couple weeks ago. The God of Israel said, the rock of Israel spoke to me. He that rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. I want to introduce another person to you. Anyone know who this is? It's Sir William Blackstone. He was an English judge, a brilliant, brilliant legal thinker, probably one of the most brilliant of all time. He wrote commentaries on the common law that are still being used today. These commentaries echo and guide jurisprudence all the time. In fact, I think we have a couple of slides about them. In 1765, in his commentaries, he wrote this: no human laws are of any validity if they are contrary to this, the law of God. See, the people who founded our nation understood things. They understood that nobody gets a carte blanche. John Wingate Thornton later wrote this. He said, we may very safely assert these two things in general without undermining government. One is that no civil rulers are to be obeyed when they enjoin things that are inconsistent with the commands of God. All such disobedience is lawful and glorious. All commands running counter to the declared will of the supreme legislator of heaven and earth are null and void, and therefore disobedience to them is a duty, not a crime. Now, to me, nobody has taken this to heart more than the good people of Michigan, because last week, Governor Gretchen Whitmer issued the most restrictive orders of any state in the nation. Michigan orders a banning of travel between residences, and sale of certain items are also banned. That takes effect. An expansive new set of restrictions went into effect over the weekend in Michigan, including restrictions on the sale of certain items, drawing rebuke from local officials. It requires Walmart and Target and other big box stores to shut down the sales of anything that they don't deem as essential. So you can go into Walmart and you can buy toilet paper, but you can't buy grass seeds. And you can not go to your brother's house, and people are being arrested because they went to someone else's house in Michigan. But the people of Michigan acted. I want to take a look at what these people did.
As you can see, thousands taking to the streets in Lansing, Michigan yesterday to protest Democratic governor's extended stay-at-home order, the strictest in the nation, with restrictions on purchases, family visits, even whether or not you could ride on a jet ski. Michonne Maddox calls the governor's orders tyrannical. She helped organize the protest and joins us right now. Michonne, good morning to you.
Good morning, Steve. That's exactly what it felt like. Only in Michigan, do you keep abortion clinics open and yet ban the sale of American flags. But that's exactly what we're facing here.
Well, she says that the rally put the health of a number of Michigan residents at risk. What do you say to that?
You know what? Thousands and thousands of people showed up in Michigan yesterday peacefully. And instead of listening to any of them and offering any kind of hope, she came out and blamed them. And she's really just doubling down every time she opens her mouth. And all I can tell you is I thank God that we have President Trump at the helm of this ship of America, because with leaders like Governor Whitmer, we're lost. In Michigan, it feels like we are oppressed right now.
The governor should simply have realized that the people who elected her to mind the store weren't interested in what she was doing. And they spoke loud and clearly. But is that what she did? Nope, not at all. But let's look at Thomas Jefferson, because he said something. He said, in questions of power, let us no more hear of confidence in man, but instead let us bind our officials down by the chains of the Constitution. No more good intentions. We just want to bind you down by the chains of the Constitution. And there's a reason for that, because as soon as those chains aren't there, they get very out of hand. Let's see what else happened in Michigan.
You're looking live at our state capitol, surrounded by protesters this noon. Those descending on Lansing are upset with the governor's executive orders that have forced many businesses to close.
All of this is in response, as you pointed out, to the governor's orders. Pardon me, I'm trying to get used to the new normal. All of this in response to the governor's orders for people to stay at home. And there are all kinds of signs on cars that talk about liberty and being locked down and quarantined and I need to work. Earlier today, the governor was on the Today Show and she talked about those orders.
Michigan has the third most COVID-19 cases in the nation right now, and we are not the third largest state in the nation. That tells you we've got a unique crisis on our hands and that it demands a unique solution. So we just had snow. I've got snow on the ground here in Michigan right now in Lansing. We're expecting, up to 30 inches in the Upper Peninsula. The fact that we're cracking down on people traveling between homes or planting or landscaping or golfing, really for a couple more weeks isn't going to meaningfully impact people's ability to do it, because the snow will do that in and of itself. But the more people that are traveling, the more people that touch that gas pump, we know that COVID-19 can last for 72 hours on stainless steel. So think about the people that have to touch that gas pump, the nurses and the police and the paramedics and the pharmacists and the food clerks that are the true superheroes now. If we're all traveling and touching the same, that means we're spreading COVID-19 and might actually take people off the front line who we desperately need to. So unless it's a life-sustaining activity, we're asking people to stay home, to do their part, and for a couple more weeks to really buckle down. We're seeing our curve start to flatten, but we all have to continue doing our part.
The Capitol steps, the scene of a protest. The whole idea here was that folks would stay in their car and participate in this gridlock, but we've seen a lot of folks who are saying they're not doing that. They're here, they're on the Capitol steps, staging a more traditional protest here in front of the Capitol building in Lansing. I want to show you one of the larger displays here, a huge sign that is out in the Capitol lawn. It says, "Security without liberty is called prison."
Emily, we're going to take a look at the map of Lansing, which really can give us some data that we can see how far this traffic is backing up. So you can see this is the main thoroughfare into downtown Lansing, 496, and that right now completely jammed up with cars. Unfortunately, we do not have available any MDOT cameras in this area, so we can't show you what it actually looks like right there. But you can also see these red and yellow lines of gridlock completely surrounding almost a mile in any direction that Capitol area. And unfortunately, again, we don't get any data coming in from the smaller streets in and around the Capitol where we've seen Rick, Leon, and Heather. But you can see that the gridlock is spreading far out and wide and continuing to slowly start to back up the highway heading into downtown Lansing. Of course, we'll continue to track this and we'll update you again at 12:30. Emily?
Yeah, this went on all day long. It went into the evening. They had over 10,000 cars just jamming the whole thing up. And a lot of the people showed up with guns. They weren't shooting, but they were making it clear, we're not playing with you. You can't do this. Why are you doing this? You can't do this. And immediately there's already talk of a recall petition for that governor. And absolutely they should. She has proven that she can't be trusted with that office, with the public office. She can't be trusted. She said, well, this is a unique situation. It demands a unique solution. Well, I'm sorry, ma'am. You just don't get the authority to trash the Constitution. You just don't have that authority. So it demands a unique solution. We figured there's too many people here, so I'm ordering a whole bunch of them to move to the Philippines because that's my unique solution. You don't have the authority to do that, and you don't have the authority to do what you're doing right now. Period. But I want to go back to Sir William Blackstone for a second. I told you he was a brilliant jurist, but he also wrote about natural rights, which included life and liberty. It was very important in the founding of our nation. His writings were very profound. And he had serious beliefs. He had a strong belief for religious tolerance. And he also had a very strong understanding of self-defense. And his writings on self-defense are what eventually became the Second Amendment of the Constitution. So let's keep this stuff in mind. The Second Amendment is the right to bear arms. And let's keep this stuff in mind. Let's go back to Michigan for a second and see what else we have.
And the governor's reaction we heard a short time ago, Rod.
Yeah, Devin, this was supposed to go from noon until 2 p.m. Take a look behind me here. They are still lining the streets. They are still blaring the horns, many with signs saying that essentially liberty and the governor's executive order have little to do with each other. Horns blared as many draped themselves in the flag. Others waved flags from the roofs of their vehicles. There were boat trailers and business vehicles. The drone video from the Conservative Coalition, which organized this rally, shows a traffic jam like few here have seen at the Capitol. Organizer Matt Seeley wanted the governor to know,
this is government overreach on steroids, and we've got to get back to just following the Bill of Rights, and people need to understand that an executive order is not the law.
Tracy Cross of White Cloud drove 2 hours to be here.
We want to end tyranny. We're tired of hearing the fear. You know, we understand, we're sympathetic to people that do catch the virus and have the virus, but it should not stop the economy. It should not stop people's lives from going forward, you know.
Donna Coor of St. Clair employs 300 people, had to lay some of them off, and is deeply concerned about Michigan business.
We're afraid that another 2 or 3 more weeks is going to be devastating, and a lot of good people are going to be put out on the streets because their businesses are going to.
The governor so far is standing by her order.
I support your right to free speech, and I respect your opinions. I just urge you, don't put yourself at risk, and don't put others at risk either. I was really disappointed to see people congregating, not wearing masks. I saw someone handing out candy to little kids, barehanded. We know that this rally endangered people. We're all in this together. I'm the governor for all 10 million people of this state, whether you support all of the policies that I've championed or not. And we've got to all do our part.
Well, I really can't hear myself think here, Devin, but here is the bottom line. This went national. The governor was on national television today. Coming up on Local 4 News at 6, we'll take a look at that and what that all means as the state goes forward. Reporting live from Lansing, Rod Maloney, Local 4.
Okay, Rod.
So Michigan wasn't the only state with a problem. California has been overreaching for a long time. Other states had demonstrations, but I want to talk about California for a second because the San Diego Sheriff Department started, we want compliance from everybody. We're issuing $1,000 fines and 6 months in jail for Californians who violate the social distancing order. Are you people out of your mind? What in the world do you think you're doing? You have no authority to do this whatsoever, period. That's what they're doing. But maybe when people stand up against tyranny, good things happen. Just like when you stand up against a bully, good things happen. Let's go back to Michigan again.
Let's bring in Darleaf. He's sheriff of Barry County, Michigan. Sheriff, thanks for coming in. You're one of the sheriffs who's saying, look, I'm not going to listen to Governor Whitmer. I'm going to defy the order. Why?
Oh, we're not saying we're not going to listen to Governor Whitmer. We're going to use common sense when it comes to enforcing it. When people are being respectful and using that 6-foot range, and we're not going to go on out and start telling people to go home. You know, like we have a lot of people out in Hastings here that are walking. We have a lot of people who want to go out and do some fishing. They're at home. And we have an order right now that you can have a kayak, you can have a canoe, but you can't have a motorboat. Well, I want people out of their house. We have an uptick of domestics from our 911 center. And I want people to get on out and get stretched and get away from the house. What better place than out in the middle of the lake when nobody's around you?
Understand. Governor Whitmer was on ABC this morning and seemed to dismiss some of what you just said and said this is all about saving lives. Watch.
4 sheriffs out of 83 sheriffs making a point, that's fine. You know what, I can take it. If it makes people feel better to take their frustrations out on me, the fact of the matter is, it's better to be 6 feet apart right now than 6 feet under. And that is the whole point of this. We've got to save lives.
You know, Thomas Jefferson talked about binding them from mischief with the chains of the Constitution, but he actually went a step further in another talk. He said, the two enemies of the people are criminals and government. So let us tie the second down with the chains of the Constitution, so the second will not become the legalized version of the first. Very important, that Constitution. That is what built this great nation. Absent of that, we would not have the nation that we have. Could not have it. Could not possibly have it. And if we were not a Christian nation, it would not have worked. And our founding fathers made that very clear too, but that's a different subject. Our founders, many of the early pastors, they all understood something. Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God. Now, if you don't understand that, then you're missing Scripture itself. So let's look at what Hosea said. I want to turn to Hosea chapter 8, please. Hosea chapter 8. We're going to start in verse 1. Hosea chapter 8. Set the trumpet to thy mouth. He shall come as an eagle against the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant and transgressed my law. Israel shall cry unto me, my God, we know you. Israel has cast off the thing that is good. The enemy shall pursue him. They have set up kings, but not by me. They have made princes, and I knew it not. Of their silver and their gold have they made idols, that they may be cut off. So we see a bunch of disobedient Israelites rebelling against God's law. And he set up kings, they set up kings whom God did not know. Now, do you think for a second that God didn't actually know what these guys were doing? Of course he knew what they were doing. That's not what he was talking about. Hosea was making it clear that these rulers were set in positions of authority without God's favor. We're supposed to honor authority so far as they govern according to the law. Paul does not command the people, but the princes themselves to be in subjection. They're not above the laws. Dr. Wilson did a great job pointing that out. Paul was in prison when he wrote that. That's what he was talking about. These princes, they're not above the laws, they're bound by them. And any magistrate that takes it upon himself to act contrary to what Paul says are the duties of those that are in authority, then that power and that magistrate is not ordained of God. And consequently, that magistrate does not command any subjection. Now, when I say that, some of you might think, oh, that's crazy. It is not. They are bound by the law. When they act outside of that law, you owe them nothing. That is true in our legal system as well. The problem is that people have become accustomed to thinking that when they speak, we must bow. That is simply not American. That is not how our nation ever got to where it is now. Nor is any subjection due, nor people forbidden to resist such authority. I want you to understand that. When you resist that authority, you're not resisting the power of God. You're resisting tyranny. You're resisting like you would resist a robber or a tyrant or an enemy. How long do you let them go? How much tyranny do you put up with until you are not able to resist? In order to be all that God has intended us to be, we absolutely must understand who we are and be free to move. Anyone know who this gentleman is? This is Adam Clarke, and he was a major theologian, one of the best leading religious thinkers of his day, founder's time. And he said this: nothing can justify the opposition of the subjects to the ruler but overt attempts on his, the ruler's part, to change the Constitution or to rule contrary to law. When the ruler acts thus, he dissolves the compact between him and the people. His authority is no longer binding. This conduct justifies opposition to his government. He was one of the leading religious thinkers at the time of the Revolution. In fact, 6 decades earlier, Pastor West, who I quoted earlier, he said this: unlimited submission and obedience is due to none but God alone. And to suppose that he gave to any particular set of men a power to require obedience to that which is unreasonable, cruel, or unjust is robbing the deity of his justice and goodness. These guys understood the word. These guys understood who God was. And these guys spoke very clearly about it. I want to take a look, talking more about the foundation of our nation. This gentleman, John Locke. John Locke was a philosopher, and he saw a better government to be formed without war. He saw that happen. And he wrote 2 treatises on government. And he said the people are born naturally free with natural rights: life, liberty, and property. Now, John Locke added property. The earlier founders, Mr. Blackstone, for example, said life and liberty. But Mr. Locke added property. Why did he add property? What quality of life do you have without property? You don't have any quality of life without property. I mean, your clothes, your dish to eat with, and the pan to cook it. That's all your property. If you have no property, you have no life. You are somebody's slave. Do you understand that? And he understood that. And so he said life, liberty, and property. And I'm not sure why our founders didn't actually carry that through. They said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Perhaps you can't possibly, perhaps someone thought, how could you be happy without property? I have no idea. But they didn't do that. But John Locke clearly understood it, and it's understood that property is essential. So look at these main founders here. Blackstone, religious tolerance, self-defense, which became the Second Amendment, natural rights. Charles de Montesquieu, he added the judiciary branch to Locke's executive and legislative branch. He believed that education is necessary for a republic to continue. And William Bradford, he understood and contributed the concept of self-government and that the majority would rule. Let's go back to verse 2 of Romans chapter 13. It says, whosoever therefore resists the power resists the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. So what's the modern interpretation of that? Well, anyone who resists or rebels against any civil authority commits a crime and thereby opposes God himself, and he will therefore be punished by God. But what exactly is rebellion? So if the modern interpretation of rebellion is correct, then look at the Old Testament. Shephar and Pau in Exodus 1, Amram and Jochebed in Exodus 2, Moses in Exodus, Rahab in Joshua, Ehud in Judges, Gideon in Judges, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel, Daniel in Daniel, Peter and John and the rest of the apostles in Acts should have all been condemned and punished by God for opposition to the rulers of their day. But they weren't. And what about America's founding fathers? Were they condemned by God for resisting the King of England and resisting the governing authority that they were under? So are Christians in transgression when they reject today's traitors as their governing authority? Pay attention to what's going on in Washington. Many of them are really traitors. They're not working for you. Who are they working for? Many of them really could be tried for treason. And I looked, and I haven't found one biblical example of God blessing someone for practicing the modern understanding of what Romans 13 means, the bowing and licking the boots of your would-be captives. So how are we Christians supposed to exist while wicked rulers reign? How are we supposed to act? Well, what did the apostles do when they were ordered to shelter in place or when they were put on lockdown by the government? Let's take a look. Oh, yeah. They didn't stay locked down for too long. As a matter of fact, they went out and challenged it time and time again. They went out and did what they were supposed to do. Lockdown? You're not locking us down, King. Now I want to introduce you to a beautiful church. Anybody recognize it? Anybody recognize that church? The Old North Church in Boston. One if by land, two if by sea. Everybody knows that church. I've been there a bunch of times. We should take a trip there sometime. Beautiful place. But there's another church that I'll bet you've never even heard of in Boston. And it's this church. Got a couple different angles of it I want you to see. It's called the Old West Church. And it is so significant. Had the Old West Church not existed, what happened at the Old North Church would never have occurred. Stay there for a moment, please. The Old West Church had a young 29-year-old pastor, and his name was Jonathan Mayhew. And Jonathan Mayhew was one of the most significant figures in American history, and most people don't even know who he is today. He was born on Martha's Vineyard, and if you ever get to Massachusetts, that's a beautiful place in the summer, a little cold in the winter. And his descendants, his ancestors, he was born like 17 whatever, and his ancestors back from the 1530s or something like that, they were granted they were granted that island, those islands, which would be Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket and whatever other islands are there, Block Island, I think, perhaps as well. And they were granted those islands. I mean, there was nothing there at the time. Now you can't buy property there; it's so crazy expensive. A little house is $5 million. I mean, it's just crazy, crazy expensive. And they were all active missionaries out there. And Jonathan Mayhew, actually graduated from Harvard and received a degree from University of Aberdeen. But he is a famous name that most of you just never heard of. Jonathan Mayhew wrote this book. Gave this message. It was a discourse concerning unlimited submission and non-resistance to the high powers, with some reflections made to King Charles I. And he gave this message on January 30th of 1749. So why did he give this message? What's in the message? His sermons and his writings were very, very powerful. But why did he give this message? It was all about whether or not you should give unlimited submission to a king. And the date that he gave it, January 30th, was the anniversary date of the death of the execution of King Charles I, who was arrested for his tyranny, escaped once, was arrested again, put on trial, and then executed. And on the anniversary of that execution, was it the 10th or the 50th or the 20th? I don't remember which one it was, but on the anniversary of it, a significant anniversary, Mayhew delivered this message. And I want to just read this for a second. You'll appreciate it. He was taking serious issue, vigorous issue, with the recent efforts that tried to portray Charles as a martyred monarch. Mayhew began with the observations of the antiquity of English liberties, that they went way back forever. The English Constitution, he asserted, is originally and essentially free. Going back to Rome, sources back then, reliable like Tacitus, made it clear that the ancient Britons were extremely jealous of their liberties. England's monarchs originally held their thrones solely by the grant of Parliament, so the ancient kings ruled by the voluntary consent of the people. After 40 pages of all this historical evidence, he reached his major point: the essential rightness of the execution of an English king when he too greatly infringed upon the British liberties. Isn't that amazing? He set the tone in the colonies. His vigor when he gave that sermon really established his reputation. And it wasn't just published in Boston, it was published in London as well. And John Adams remembered him long after his sermon. And listen to what he said. Everybody read his sermon. In fact, it was the first volley of the American Revolution. It set forth the intellectual and scriptural justification for rebellion against the crown. The entire American Revolution was fired from the pulpits in New England because they understood what tyranny was and they understood what freedom was. I want to just take a look at a couple things he said here and we'll close up. John Mayhew said, "The king is as much bound by his oath not to infringe the legal rights of the people as the people are bound to yield subjection to him. From whence it follows that as soon as the prince sets himself above the law, he loses the king and becomes a tyrant. He does, to all intents and purposes, unking himself." Now, the governor of New Jersey was on recently, this week, and was grilled about the things he's doing. He's also arresting people, including going into churches and arresting the people for going to church or a synagogue. So let's take a look at that. I want to hear what he had to say.
So you made that decision, and as I noted before, 15 congregants at a synagogue in New Jersey were arrested and charged for being in a synagogue together. Now, the Bill of Rights, as you well know, protects Americans' right, enshrines their right to practice their religion as they see fit and to congregate together, to assemble peacefully. By what authority did you nullify the Bill of Rights in issuing this order? How do you have the power to do that?
That's above my pay grade, Tucker. So I wasn't thinking of the Bill of Rights when we did this. We went to first of all, we looked at the data and the science, and it says people have to stay away from each other. That's the best thing we could do to break the back of the curve of this virus that leads to lower hospitalizations and ultimately fatalities.
And I'm not contesting that, though. I think I do think there's a debate. This is a rolling conversation because we're learning new things every day, and nothing is settled at this point.
Understood.
But I do want, since you are an elected official, a leader in the government, an executive, how do you have the authority to order something that so clearly contravenes the Bill of Rights of the United States, the U.S. Constitution? Where do you get the authority to do that?
Well, here's the thing. We know we need to stay away from each other, number one. Number two, we do have broad authority within the state. And number three, we would never do that without coordinating, discussing, and hashing it out with the leaders, the variety of the leaders of the faiths in New Jersey. We are among, if not the most diverse state in America, so we're used to that.
I'm sure that you talked to every rabbi and priest, but there's a deeper question here, and I'm just going to ask you one last time because I think it's important. I'm sure you've thought about this. You can't just, as the governor of a state, tell people who they can talk to when and where, because the Constitution of the United States, upon which all of this is based, prohibits you from doing that. So you clearly decided that you could do it. Did you consult an attorney about this? Did you, because this is a legal question as well as a medical one, isn't it?
I don't go to the men's room without consulting an attorney, so I guarantee you we did that. But that's not denying someone their right to worship in any way, that we have to find a different way to worship. And I think that's the point. God bless America.
Yeah, government's not allowed to tell people how to worship just as a sort of factual one. Last question.
Yeah, pal. You're unworthy to sit in that office. Oh, that's above my pay grade. Yeah, that's above my pay grade. Yeah, I don't get that at all. Yeah, then you're not worthy to sit there. And his answer is, well, I don't care what the Constitution says. I'll do what I want. I go back to Thomas Jefferson. No more of your good intentions. We're going to bind you down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. Listen to something else Mr. Mayhew said. They are more properly, he's talking about tyrants, the messengers of Satan to buffet us. No rulers are properly God's ministers, but such as are just, ruling in the fear of God. When once magistrates act contrary to their office and to the end of their institutions, and when they rob and ruin the public, instead of being guardians of its peace, They immediately cease to be the ordinance and ministers of God, and no more deserve that glorious character than the common pirates and highwaymen. He also said this: people are not usually deprived of their liberties all at once, but gradually, by one encroachment after another, as it is found they are deposed to bear them. That is why you cannot give up any of the liberties at all. We cannot just roll over and allow them to do whatever they want to do. Listen to what Judge Napolitano had to say about what's going on right now in Michigan.
Thousands of protesters flooded Michigan State's Capitol over the governor's stay-at-home order. Listen.
Instead of looking at essential and non-essential, let's start looking at what's safe and unsafe and start getting people back to work.
Quarantine is for the sick, not for the healthy. It's time to open up.
We're going to take our liberties and we're going to keep them and we're going to fight for them.
The order is the strictest in the nation, with pushes back on family visits. Can't go to your own summer house. Can't use a jet ski. Can't use a motorboat, but can use a canoe. Let's bring in the host of Liberty File, on Fox Nation, Judge Andrew Napolitano. Judge, these restrictions are ridiculous, and thousands of people came out to protest. Does it surprise you?
It surprises me that it took them this long to come out, Brian. Good morning. It's always good to be on with you, even if we're so far apart from each other. This is a blatant violation of the Bill of Rights, a blatant violation of freedom of assembly, of your right to purchase a product that you decide is essential. If you go to a big box store in Michigan and you decide, instead of buying cereal, I want to buy grass seed, instead of buying paper towels, I want to buy a garden hose, you have violated the governor's executive order, and theoretically, because she's threatened to do this, she'll shut down the big box store because they sold you grass seed and a garden hose instead of cereal and paper towels. These are not decisions for the government to make. These are decisions for individuals to make. And the sooner we take our freedoms back, the less likely the government will be able to continue doing this. And if we don't take our freedoms back, they might not come back.
And it's really getting tough now because it wasn't the only place there were protests. But let me just see, let everybody hear what the governor said. Quote, we question some restrictions that Governor Whitmer has imposed as overstepping her authority. This is according to the protester. She has created a vague framework of emergency laws that only confuse Michigan citizens. As a result, will not have strict enforcement of these orders. So they're not going to comply. Guess where else they're protesting? They're protesting in Kentucky, Ohio, North Carolina, and Virginia. And as more and more states go online and get their rights back, that is going to fuel, I believe, other states to go, wait a second, this is getting ridiculous. You got 29 states without a big imprint from this virus. Don't you think that's where it's heading, Judge?
I do think that's where it's heading. You know, here in New Jersey, the governor boasts. He boasted to Tucker Carlson last night, the Bill of Rights is above my pay grade. The Bill of Rights is above your pay grade. You took a solemn oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, which includes the Bill of Rights. When these governors try to write law rather than enforce law that the legislature has written, they violate the federal Constitution, they violate the state Constitution, and in the case of Governor Murphy in New Jersey, who says the Bill of Rights is above his pay grade, that's the felony of misconduct in office. It's an impeachable offense for a governor either knowingly or negligently to crush civil liberties, as these governors have done.
And Judge, 10 seconds. I feel bad for law enforcement. They have to enforce these ridiculous rules. Your thoughts?
Brian, I have spoken to cops. They hate what the governors are making them do. Most of the cops that I've spoken to, their hearts are with the people.
Got you, Judge.
Then, if that's the case, the police should get together and arrest the governor because they've committed felonies. We don't have too many courageous police officers because that's what they should be doing. They are not there to do the unlawful bidding of a king. They are there to enforce law. If the governor shot somebody recklessly, went out and murdered somebody, the police officers nearby would arrest the governor, rest assured. So, what about our civil rights? When do we get those back? Answer, it was a trick question. We don't have civil rights. We have God-given rights that they may never take. Please understand that. When do we get them back? We take them back. Don't let them take them. Very important. I wanted to show you a Supreme Court decision. The case was Marbury versus Madison. And this is what it said. All the laws which are repugnant to the Constitution are null and void. The Constitution will have been made in pursuance of the powers granted by it. Every usurpation of that law is repugnant to it, and it cannot have been made in the pursuance of its powers. Marbury, according to legal scholars, remains the single most important decision in American constitutional law. That decision established that the Constitution is actual law, not just a statement of political principles and ideals. Let's take a look at Mr. Marbury. Can I have a couple more minutes? You guys okay with 5 more minutes? I'll wrap this up. Okay. Mr. Marbury. He said this, to say that subjects in general are not proper judges of the law when their governors oppress them and play the tyrant, and when they defend their rights, is as great a treason as ever a man uttered. What does that mean? Put it into, that's the sort of Old English. Here's what he said. If you suggest that the people of the nation are not the proper judges of their officials, and they're not there to call them out and to reprimand them and to discipline them, then you are speaking the greatest treason that has ever been uttered. That's what he said. He also said this, after studying this whole issue, he said, I now add further that the apostles' argument is so far from proving that it is the duty of the people to obey and to submit to such rulers as act in contradiction to the public good, and so to the design of their office, that it proves the direct contrary. That when you really understand Romans 13, it proves the exact opposite. The last thing we should be doing is obeying them. Mr. Mayhew was a Dudleyan lecturer in Harvard. And I thought that was interesting. I had to look up and see what is a Dudleyan lecture. It was started by an endowment in 1755. And a man named Paul Dudley gave what today would be a little over $4,000 as an endowment. And he wanted lectures about religion to happen. And every year since 1755, Harvard has had Dudleyan scholars who are the leading religious thinkers to talk on these particular things. I just thought that was interesting. And it was also interesting that Mr. Mayhew died in July of 1766, which I thought was interesting. Quarter of a century after he died, someone at the Harvard commencement delivered these lines. When Britons claim by laws our rights to lead, and faith was fettered by a bigot's creed, then mental freedom first her power displayed, and called a Mayhew to religion's aid. For this great truth he boldly led the van, that private judgment was the right of man. Well known. We would not have America today if it wasn't for his preaching. And he said this also. He said, not to discontinue our allegiance in this case, when there's tyrants, would be to join with the sovereign in promoting the slavery and misery of that society, the welfare of which we ourselves, as well as the sovereign, should be obliged to secure and promote as far as it lies in us. He said it would be stupid tameness and unaccountable folly for whole nations to suffer one unreasonable, ambitious, cruel man to wanton and riot in the misery. Till people find themselves greatly abused and oppressed by their governors, they are not apt to complain. And whenever they do, in fact, find themselves thus abused and oppressed, they must be stupid not to complain. Common tyrants and public oppressors are not entitled to obedience from their subjects by virtue of anything here laid down by the inspired apostle. This little thing called the Declaration of Independence, this little thing called the Continental Congress, none of that happened by accident. None of that happened without great understanding and great sacrifice. And I'll close with this. There was a gentleman named Fisher Ames. He was a representative from Massachusetts. And he said this: a monarchy is a merchantman that sails well, but will sometimes strike a rock and go to the bottom. A republic is a raft which will never sink, but then your feet are always in the water getting wet. These are great people who understood what tyranny was and what the true biblical response to it should be. And I want to suggest to you that the definition of a tyrant is someone who goes outside of the bounds of the law that they are supposed to live by. Period. What the governors are doing is tyrannical. They do not have the authority to suspend the Constitution and ignore it. And that's all I have to say about that.